Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. And I'll try not to destroy U.S. government property during the course of this event. My name is Tony Banbury, and I'm the brand new President and Chief Executive Officer of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES. I've been in the job 9 days. This is my first event on the Hill, and one of the many great things I found about the organization is the tremendous diversity of its staff, but also the issues we work on and sponsoring events like this. So I'm really happy to be here today with all of you for such what I think will be an interesting event. I'd really like to thank Congresswoman Sheila Lee for sponsoring this and her staff for helping to organize it, together with the staff from IFES, particularly Liz Seidel. I also want to thank, of course, the panelists, and Liz will introduce them, and they're the experts, and you'll hear from them. And I'm going to be very, very brief so you can hear from the real experts. But I spent most of my career in the United Nations, so I am a big believer in the SDGs. And I also, during the course of that career, spent a lot of time working abroad in different countries in conflict, post-conflict transition, challenging paths of development. And I saw again and again and again in those societies how kind of men were creating the conflict and women were holding the societies together, the families together, the communities together through strength of character, through determination, through entrepreneurial spirit. And for the subject of today in SDG 5, in achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls, I really believe, based on my experience, it's not just the right thing to do, it's very much the smart thing to do. Society benefits so much from that kind of when equality and empowerment are advanced. And in the context of strengthening democracies through women's empowerment, I've seen it abroad, but also here in the US, and taking that entrepreneurial spirit from the private sector and economic development to the Hill. I think the research is already sort of clear out there. When women are in Congress and sponsoring legislation, there are more co-sponsors in legislation. Legislation is more focused on helping real people, helping families, helping communities, helping individuals, particularly individuals or groups that are facing various pressures of exclusion. So I'm really excited to hear from the panelists because I believe so strongly in this issue. So great to be here. I'll hand it over to Liz to introduce them all and look forward to hearing from them. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Tony. We'll try and keep the podium standing during this particular event. So as Tony said, he began as IFES's president and CEO on November 1st, and we really are lucky to have such a staunch supporter of human rights and women's empowerment leading us. I also want to echo Tony's thanks to the Office of Congresswoman Sheila Lee and her fantastic staff for supporting this event. So good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hi. So my name is Liz Seidel. I'm IFES's Senior Congressional Liaison. Today's panel will explore Target 5A of SDG 5, which is women's right to economic resources. So at IFES, we empower women to equitable participation in electoral and political processes. We recognize that no matter the facet of public life, including women at the table in both big and small ways can bring unyielding returns. So for example, in IFES's work, we found that more women poll workers lead to more women casting a vote. And from today's panel, you'll hear how, for example, simply including more women as loan officers leads to a greater flow of capital to women entrepreneurs. So our panelists will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll turn to audience questions and remarks. The Congresswoman may visit with us. There's leadership conversations going on right now, so it's more than likely she won't, but if she does, we'll just pause proceedings, let her speak, and then resume. So to introduce today's panel, we have Dr. Muge Finkel, who flew down from Pittsburgh this morning just for us, so we appreciate that. She is an assistant professor of international development at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Finkel is also the co-founder and co-director of Girl at Pitt, the Gender Inequality Research Lab, a new interdisciplinary research forum for scholars and practitioners to collaborate on policy-relevant research on gender equality. Prior to her academic appointment, Dr. Finkel worked as a social development specialist at the World Bank for the Middle East and North Africa region and consulted for the International Food Policy Research Institute. Her current research focuses on the politics of public sector employment and opportunities for women. She'll provide an academic overview of women's economic empowerment. Rachel Vogelstein is the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow and Director of the Women Foreign Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. For over a decade, Vogelstein served as a top counselor to Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton on domestic and global women's issues. During the Obama administration, Vogelstein was a member of the White House Council on Women and Girls and was a top official in the Office of Global Women's Issues at the U.S. Department of State. Using data from two of CFR's recent studies, Vogelstein will explain the broader implications of women's economic empowerment, including how it benefits whole economies. Barbara Langley is the director of the Center for Women's Economic Empowerment at the Center for International Private Enterprise, better known as CIPE. Prior to her position at CIPE, Langley served for nearly 20 years at the International Republican Institute. She has worked extensively with marginalized sectors of society, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities. She leads CIPE's strategy to amplify the voice of the private sector through women's equal participation, free markets, and democratic institutions. Langley will share tangible examples of impact from the field, using CIPE's experience with its women's national business agenda in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Robert Runge is a senior gender specialist in Equality and Inclusion Department at Solidarity Center. Runge is also a professional lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School. Runge is one of the pioneers in the field of gender-based violence in the workplace. She is an expert on the development of policies and laws domestically and internationally to address the impact of domestic violence, sexual violence, dating violence, and stalking on women in the workplace. She'll discuss how organized labor can be an effective tool for social change. And then before we begin, a quick note, the World Bank has an important initiative on women's economic empowerment called the Women's Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative. We hope that they could join us today, but it's just not possible logistically. WeFee's materials are available on the table outside. We hope they can join us for a future panel. So with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Finkel.
Will I be using the podium? So I'll be the one who will back the podium. Good afternoon, thank you very much. I'm honored to have been invited to be part of this very distinguished panel, and also very happy that I get to one day out of campus, so I appreciate the opportunity. What I would like to do this afternoon is to focus my remarks on the challenges women still face in realizing economic empowerment and point to some promising ways forward, if I can. We know that SDG 5 aims for gender equality and empowerment, but we also know that that path to achieving it is complicated, multifaceted, and uneven. It is complicated because one-size-fits-all interventions often treat women as a homogeneous group, and they fail to take into account their diverse identities, as they may be shaped by race, ethnicity, age, and motherhood status. Economic empowerment in itself is multifaceted process. It involves much more than an increase of incomes, and it reaches into rights, decision-making power, and political voice. And almost 3 years into SDGs, we have a very uneven track record to show for progress. We have been successful in addressing some of the issues such as extreme poverty, health and education disparities, but we have been much less successful in other aspects of empowerment, such as equal access to formal and gainful employment, and as well as agency, access to leadership positions in elected and non-elected public institutions charged with policymaking. So to that end, all the factors impeding women's economic empowerment, I would like to suggest the following 5, simply because this is not an exhaustive list, but simply because these 5 are the ones that can be easily linked to alternatives for policy choice going forward. While we have done relatively well with extreme poverty, we have been much less successful in cycles and pockets of poverty that disproportionately affect women. As you can see, women are poorer through their life cycles, especially so earlier years and in later life. We also know that within the US, of the 18 million women who live in poverty, 1 in 7 are the heads of households. In Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, where I live, about 77% of families living below the poverty line are households headed by a single woman raising children. We also know that while we have helped increase incomes, we haven't been nearly effective in addressing pay gaps. Men are still being paid much more than women, and their earnings are increasing more rapidly. This means that we're going to have to face up a pay gap that is only widening. In the US, we know that very empirically, that race and gender differences are still very significant. White men earn the most and Hispanic women earn the least. At current pace of progress, wage gap for women is expected to close in 2059 for white women, 21-24 for black women, 22-33 for Hispanic women. In my classes, once in a while, I ask my students, just to kind of give them the challenge, imagine how old you're going to be when we finally achieve these. I wish I could do that for you too, here too, but it's even harder to imagine as we go along. We also know that globally fewer gender gaps in education remain. We have done a relatively good job. We have successfully achieved parity in primary and secondary schooling, and women make up an equal or larger share of those who are attending universities in 93 countries. Nonetheless, economic outcomes are significantly less favorable for women, much more so than could be explained by the remaining gaps in education. But it is not as simple as saying that men and women are doing the same job and getting paid differently, although that is definitely part of the story. It is also because women are more likely to work in industries with lower average pay rather than high income areas such as finance and technology. And they're less likely to be hired for leadership roles. In the US, we know that women make up 90% of the adult low-wage workforce and only 6.5% of the high-wage workers in 2017. Finally, and perhaps more importantly, women do not have equal representation in either elected or non-elected public leadership roles. This salient lack of leadership in public offices tend to limit women's agency, voice, and representation of interests. The updated projection from the 2018 US congressional elections is 100 women. This will put us at 23%, and we will be ranked 77th globally, same rank as Singapore. At current rate progress, we expect the Congress will reach parity in 2114. Gender equality in public administration, that is in non-elected offices, are equally important. Public administration offers women the most expensive employment opportunities, if not the only available ones in most of the world. Therefore, the extent to which public administrations are committed to parity in participation and leadership roles impacts opportunities for half of the world's population. Secondly, as policymaking bodies in governments, representativeness and inclusiveness of public administrations tend to shape the quality of the policies that it produces. So going forward with solutions, we know a few options that can provide shortcuts to enhancing women's economic empowerment. For example, equal pay has a chance of addressing pockets and cycles of poverty that women oftentimes find themselves in. Minimum wage seems to help lift the poorest among us the most, which happen to be predominantly women. To effectively engage in policymaking, women really need to have a presence in sufficient numbers in both elected and non-elected leadership roles in public office. IFAS is beginning to conceptualize this group as public sector entrepreneurs. We clearly see the effect of elected offices in policy outcomes, such as the smaller pay gaps. As for the effects of the non-elected positions, we expect to find similarly positive effects on the quality and the equality of policy outcomes, getting us closer to achieving not only SDG 5, but also SDG 16, which calls for building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies by ensuring representative decision-making in all public institutions. To recap, I suggest we think about women's economic empowerment as having three main features. That we need to continue to invest in capabilities. This will mean that we will have to continue to do better, even though we are already doing better. We should just push for even more investments in poverty, health, and education. But we also need to start substantiating these investments with opportunities that are created legally and protected legally, such as the pay gap and equal pay opportunities. But more importantly, we need to spend some time understanding the agency and representation in leadership and policymaking decisions in both elected and non-elected offices. And I suggest we also start paying attention to some of the creative partnerships that are around us. WIFI, the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, is a new World Bank initiative, as Liz mentioned. And it is created to support women-led businesses, specifically focusing on their need for short-term finance needs, loans, access to technology, market connections, networks, and training. I also want to mention one other, which I call the creative partnership. As you can see, I picked these partnership based on their funky acronyms. JEPA stands for Gender Equality for Public Administration. It has been a 3-year-long research collaboration between the UNDP and Girl and Pet, where we are working to identify where women are in public administration globally and how their roles can be expanded beyond the glass walls and glass ceilings. You might imagine, or at least when we started this research project 3 years ago, we thought it would be much easier to figure out where the government employees are, how much they're paid, what jobs do they take, and how we can identify their leadership positions and their effect on policy outcomes. It has proven to be one of the most challenging academic tasks I have undertaken. So it keeps us going, and I invite you to join us in the search if you have information, if you'd like to join our research group, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate the context on the pink wave we keep hearing so much about, and I was very interested to hear about the data gaps. So, Rachel?
Thank you. First, let me thank Tom and IFAS for hosting today's briefing, to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, of course, for her leadership on these issues. It's a privilege to be with all of you today. So, at the Women in Foreign Policy program at the Council on Foreign Relations, we analyze how elevating the status of women and girls advances U.S. foreign policy objectives. And here is what the research shows. If you take away nothing today, let it be this one succinct conclusion. In the 21st century, no country can get ahead if half of its population is left behind. Nowhere is this more true than in the area of women's economic participation. Today, there's a really strong body of evidence that demonstrates that women's economic participation actually grows prosperity for everyone. Major financial institutions, from the International Monetary Fund to the World Bank, they've concluded that when women's economic participation goes up, we see GDP go up and poverty go down. The World Economic Forum, which you may be aware is not exactly a bastion of feminist theory, has concluded that in countries where the gap between men and women is closest to being closed on a range of factors, some of which you heard mentioned today, that those countries are actually more prosperous and more secure. So we've put together a new digital report entitled Growing Economies Through Gender Parity, which helps to visualize the relationship between women's economic participation and GDP growth, drawing on data collected by the McKinsey Global Institute in 2015. And here's what our report shows. Closing the gender gap in the workforce could add a staggering $28 trillion to the global GDP. We find that both advanced and developing countries stand to gain if women participate in the labor force at the same rate as men, work the same number of hours as men, and are employed at the same levels as men across sectors. And here you can see some important regional gains that we would see if we close the gap between men and women. So the growth potential of gender parity in the workplace is really quite staggering. Here, a spotlight on the United States, we would gain $4.3 trillion in GDP by 2025 simply by closing the gap between men and women in the workforce. In East and Southeast Asia, Japan stands to gain $1.6 trillion, Indonesia, $537 billion, South Korea, $471 billion, again, simply by closing gaps between men and women at work. Here, a quick snapshot of the Middle East and North Africa. Turkey would gain an estimated $720 billion, and Saudi Arabia, which you may have been reading in the news, is a country that recently rescinded a range of barriers to women's economic participation, including, of course, its notorious driving ban. That country stands to gain $586 billion, and in fact, I would argue and have argued in some of the writing that I've done recently that the reason that we are seeing the changes that we're seeing in Saudi Arabia is because of this economic imperative. So through our interactive, which I encourage you to go online and play around with, you can actually compare country gains. So here, for example, you can see the US GDP would grow by 19% by closing workplace gaps between men and women, whereas in India, you would see GDP grow by a remarkable 60%. Here's another comparison. In Mexico, GDP gains would reach 43%, and Saudi Arabia, again with a spotlight on what they're doing there, you can see gains of up to 50%. So what does the research tell us are the most important levers to promote economic growth through gender parity? We've identified 4 specific issues that, if addressed, would do the most to achieve gender equality at work and therefore generate significant progress towards realizing economic gains. And those 4 issues are education level, financial and digital inclusion, legal protection, and reducing the disparity in unpaid care work. So at CFR, we recommended that the US government, in light of this research, pursue a range of policies together with partner governments, multilateral organizations, the private sector, and civil society to do the following: incentivize legal and policy reform, increase women's access to capital and financial services. We propose creating an economic inclusion challenge fund to incentivize more work in this area, promotion of technology and innovation with particular focus on the gaps that we see for women in the developing world, supporting research and data collection on women's economic participation, including property ownership. You'd be surprised at how little we know at the household level about who owns assets, men versus women, and that lack of knowledge, I think, shields a lot of the disparities that we see at the household level. And finally, and importantly, to enact US domestic policies to help lead by example. And I'm happy to talk at greater length about any of those policy recommendations. So the evidence is clear, and yet, despite the very real benefits of women's economic participation, there are significant legal, structural, and cultural barriers that persist. And we've heard about some of those already. The most significant barriers, according to our research, are legal restrictions, unpaid care work disparities, education level. There are still some gaps, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, between girls and boys that undermine girls' achievement there and their ability to compete in the workplace there. And then finally, financial and digital inclusion. So I'm going to talk at greater length about one of these critical preconditions to women's economic participation, and that's legal equality for women at work. We have recently launched the Women's Workplace Equality Index, which is the first ever global index to rank 189 countries based on how level the legal playing field is for women in the workforce. So I'm going to talk at greater length about that, although certainly addressing the constellation of barriers that you've already heard about from my colleague would be critical to realize the full economic benefits that we've just talked through. So our index finds that most countries in the world still have laws on the books that make it harder for women to work than men. And this equality shortchanges not only women, but entire economies. So for example, here in the slide you can see that there are 104 countries that restrict the kinds of jobs that women can hold. Worldwide, these discriminatory laws prevent 2.75 billion women from working in industries like mining and energy and agriculture. And I think it's important to note that these are not only countries that might immediately come to your mind. There are countries in Western Europe that still have these laws on the books. In France, women can't perform certain jobs in distilleries. In Russia, there are 456 differences in how men and women are treated with respect to the types of jobs they can hold. So this disparity exists in almost every country in the world. We know that 75 countries restrict women's property rights. That means widows have fewer inheritance rights than widowers, or that daughters cannot inherit in the same ways as sons. And legal inequalities with respect to property translate to less collateral, and that impedes women's entrepreneurship and broader economic growth. This is an important one given the current conversation we're having here in the US and globally about sexual harassment and assault. 59 countries around the world provide no legal protection whatsoever against sexual harassment in the workplace. So think about how challenging things are in a place where we have a law like Title VII on the books. There are many countries where there isn't even a law to fall back on. And this is true even though we know from the evidence that women are more likely to be financially and economically active in nations that prohibit sexual harassment in the workplace. And there are 18 countries that still require women to have their husband's permission in order to work outside the home. So the laws look differently in different parts of the world. And you can see from the map where some of those laws that still restrict women from a spousal consent perspective, where they're concentrated. But I think the take-home message is that these barriers really exist everywhere. They just look different in different countries, and they're more or less severe in different countries. So here's just a snapshot that shows you all of the different legal restrictions that we have tallied that we could fit on one slide, and there are many more that we couldn't fit. Some others just to mention: in 29 countries, women cannot work the same night hours as men. In 36 countries, female surviving spouses do not have equal rights to inherit. In 75 countries, mothers are not guaranteed an equivalent position after taking parental leave. And 117 countries do not prohibit discrimination by creditors on the basis of sex. So a quick note on methodology. What indicators did we use to inform the rankings that I'm talking to you about? We relied on the World Bank's Women, Business, and the Law data set, which I commend to all of you, and it evaluates 7 broad categories. The first is accessing institutions. The second is building credit. The third, the ability to get a job. The fourth, the ability to go to court. The fifth, protecting women from violence, given that we know that women can function more freely in society and in the business world when not faced with the threat of violence. Incentives to work, and that can be anything from tax credits, child care, parental leave, paid leave, and of course, property. So now I'm sure you're wondering, how did these 189 countries fare on our index? So let's go ahead and look at the results. Here you can see in this slide the top 10 countries, and they are Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Spain, Mexico, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the UK, Lithuania, Iceland, and Latvia. All of the top-ranked countries score at least 90 out of 100 on protecting women's access to institutions and their use of property. Many countries, though, do miss the mark on protecting women from violence, on providing incentives to work, and on eliminating barriers to jobs. And importantly, no country gets a perfect score on women's workplace equality, although Australia comes the closest with a score of 94.9 out of 100. Please notice that the United States does not make the top 10, and this is in part because of the absence of important workplace policies like paid family leave and some others. That's the top 10, and now rounding out the bottom of our list, here are the 10 bottom-ranked countries: Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq, Mauritania, Iran, Sudan, Qatar, Syria, and Yemen. Notably, the 10 bottom-ranked countries have near zero scores for protecting women from violence and allowing women to build credit. So almost all of these countries fail completely on both of those counts. Yemen, of course, a conflict country, is ranked dead last with a score of 24.2 out of 100. I want to, again, encourage you to play around with this data set as well. You can actually explore each country's overall average score, indicator scores, so scores on particular issues that I've mentioned, the global ranking, as well as the country's ranking within its own income group and region. So here is just a snapshot of some of that information for the United States. And here's the United States again, so you can see how the US fares as compared to other OECD nations, as compared to other high-income countries, and then globally. You can also, as a user of this information, explore each country's particular legal barriers and the types of reforms related to women's workplace equality, both positive and negative, that each country has implemented in recent years, so between 2015 and the present. So here is a quick snapshot on Afghanistan, and you'd be able to search this for any of the 189 countries we've got data for. So I think it's also important to note, given that I've given you a bit of a bad news story on women's legal equality in the workplace, that governments are actually beginning to understand the cost of these legal restrictions and of inequality for women in the workplace and to take action. So between 2015 and the present, we've found that actually over 110 countries carried out more than 180 reforms to improve women's economic opportunities. And I think we've seen important recognition, not just by women's advocates, but by world leaders, thinking in particular of leaders like the Prime Minister of Japan, who incorporated a focus on women's economic participation as a pillar of his economic strategy, or even the recent changes in Saudi Arabia, again, really driven by a recognition that as Saudi moves from a largely oil-based economy to a more diversified economy, that using 100% of your population is critical to making progress economically. So I think it's important also to note that there has long been a compelling human rights-based case for elevating the status of women and girls. But what our research demonstrates at the Council is that promoting women's economic participation is not just the right thing to do, though it certainly is that, but that it's also the smart thing to do. And policies to level the legal playing field for women in the workplace, we argue, will advance U.S. interests in prosperity and stability around the world and redound to the benefit of us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So maybe many of us will be moving to Australia after this panel. I'd like to pass it on to Barbara.
Thank you, and I confess I was a little bit worried about not taking out just the podium, but also the panel and all the electronics. So I thought I'd walk around for that reason. I'd like to thank IFAS and also Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee's office for the opportunity today to talk with you a bit about CIPE's experience, the Center for International Private Enterprise. I believe my remarks will complement the research that was discussed by my colleagues prior to my discussion, and also illustrate for you the leadership potential that women's economic empowerment programming generates. This is kind of a grassroots story, and will illustrate kind of what we're talking about. Recently, SIPE sat down with one of our local program partners. Her name is Salima Ahmed, and she's the president of the Bangladesh Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We more commonly call it BWCCI, so if I start with the acronym, now you know who I'm referring to. During that conversation, we reflected on our partnership, which took place over about 12 years, and included capacity building programs that fostered entrepreneurship in her country. And Salima told us this during this conversation. The best part of entrepreneurship is feeling worthy, that you are producing and selling, hiring, giving jobs to other people, including women, supporting your family, that you're the boss of your own life, that you're paying taxes, and more importantly, as a taxpayer, you can ask for accountability from your government. That sort of empowerment can only be enhanced through entrepreneurship. We talked a little bit about our organization, but I thought I'd give you a little bit more background and detail about our programs. The Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE, is a nonprofit affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and is a core institute of the National Endowment for Democracy. CIPE's mission is to strengthen democracy around the globe through private enterprise and free market reform, fulfilling a vision of a world where democracy delivers the freedom and opportunity for all to prosper. CIPE's Center for Women's Economic Empowerment launched in 2018 with the belief that economies prosper when women entrepreneurs like Salima Ahmed and the members of BWCCI have a voice in shaping the laws and policies that govern their businesses. The center democratizes opportunity for women by fostering ecosystems for entrepreneurship, utilizing CIPE's 35-year history of partnering with the private sector, civil society, and government to implement innovative and successful programs for women and girls worldwide. Through the center, CIPE contributes directly to UN Sustainable Development Goal number 5, particularly the targets of ensuring women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels, undertaking reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial services, inheritance, and natural resources in accordance with national laws. And also adopting and strengthening sound policies and enforceable legislation for the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls worldwide at all levels. CIPE's impact on SDG 5 has come through one of the most pivotal projects in our programming history, the Business Agenda. CIPE adopted the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's National Business Agenda Advocacy Tool and applied it to address barriers to women's legal participation in commerce in developing countries like Bangladesh. A women's business agenda is used to mobilize collective action among the business community and other civil society stakeholders to affect public policy reform by setting legislative and regulatory priorities and clearly communicating them to policymakers. The agenda is both a process and a product, whereby women business leaders identify barriers faced, particularly by women in starting and growing their businesses. They research and draft and publish solutions to these barriers and advocate to government officials to change antiquated, confusing, or contradictory laws and regulations. As the diagram on the slide shows us, the process is cyclical. Stakeholders consult their constituency groups on the legal and regulatory barriers. They conduct research to define priorities and to develop recommendations. They develop a reform roadmap and advocate passage of recommendations with governing officials. And then they evaluate the reform measures and the impact the women's business agenda had on its stakeholders. The stakeholders then reconvene the process and continue the advocacy path with a new set of priorities. The direct impact of legal barriers facing women in commerce is quantifiable, with impressive numbers of how the ecosystem changes for women business owners. For example, in Bangladesh, microfinance hasn't supported entrepreneurs seeking to grow from micro to small and medium-sized enterprises since the 1980s. This issue impacted women business owners in ways different from their male counterparts. To address this issue, SITE partnered with BWCCI to develop a Women's National Business Agenda, or WNBA, not to be confused with the Women's National Basketball Association. The Bangladesh Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry was founded in 2001 with 24 members and is now a group of over 3,500 members organized in several branches around the country. SITE began its partnership with BWCCI in 2006 with two major goals: provide training to the board of directors and staff to build the organization's financial sustainability, and to encourage BWCCI to move away from simply training female entrepreneurs to encourage them to participate in policy advocacy through a WNBA. Bangladesh's WNBA formulated 30 policy recommendations that first year for 3 categories of barriers, including social, capacity, and financial barriers. For example, the WNBA outlined such financial challenges as the bank's unacceptance of women entrepreneurs as clients, discriminatory inheritance laws, as we had heard before, and a high interest rates on loans. The final agenda was submitted to the government, and as a result, the central bank instructed commercial banks to increase lending to women-owned businesses, including through collateral-free loans at a reduced interest rate. And just to prove the point on the capital that can be generated through these types of programs, today more than $93 million in loans to small and medium enterprises have been provided to 20,000 women in Bangladesh. The proportion of women entrepreneurs in the country receiving commercial bank loans has increased from 19% in 2007 to over 50% in 2014. Also by 2014, more than 65% of the country's banks had dedicated desks for female borrowers, staffed with personnel trained to cater to business women's needs. With several Women's National Business Agendas now under its belt in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, SITE is recognizing how this advocacy tool not just improves the legal barriers to women in commerce, but also addresses the more traditional and non-traditional barriers to women's empowerment. A colleague from the International Financial Corporation once described traditional barriers to women's empowerment to me as the 5 C's. These barriers include capital, confidence, connections, capacity, and contracts. A few of the C's can be measured quantitatively, such as increased capital, increased access to capital or credit and contracts, but the indirect benefits are sometimes harder to understand. Changes in a woman's confidence to go out and start her business or advocate for her rights comes from capacity building training and building connections within the community. This confidence can lead to women becoming leaders in their community and more likely engage in local politics. As we look back to SITE's initial consultations with Salima Ahmed in 2006, we can see that her story is quite remarkable. In the early 2000s, the law in Bangladesh regulating business organizations, called the Trade Organization Ordinance, didn't allow for the possibility of an association with only women members, which could support women in business. This changed was Salima's vision for women in business, as she challenged the system by founding a new entity, BWCCI. Despite resistance from established male-dominated chambers, Ahmed finally received a license to register her new chamber in 2001. And by 2006, when SITE first encountered BWCCI, the organization's membership had grown from 24 at its founding to about 300 members. BWCCI, as I mentioned before, now boasts a membership of more than 3,500 members. Aside from the success of BWCCI, Salima has been recognized by organizations around the world for her leadership and advocacy efforts. Through economic empowerment, she has transformed into a major leader in her community. Salima has also served as a mentor to many in Pakistan and throughout the region. Today, Salima is still working with female entrepreneurs to develop leadership skills and become politically active themselves. She's able to inspire other women, increase their capacity, and gain confidence to advocate for the rights of women. In fact, Salima has gone on to build her capacity in women's political empowerment. Through SITE's sister organization, the International Republican Institute, Salima has worked on campaign training and is now running in Bangladesh's December elections. So we wish her well and hope that she succeeds. Thankfully, we won the debate long ago that the key to women's social and political empowerment, that the key to women's social and political leadership is economic empowerment. However, the question now is how? How do we achieve economic equality? I don't believe that there's necessarily a single silver bullet. Programs focused on microfinance and business incubators, among others, have witnessed great impact. The key is a holistic approach that fosters dialogue among the private sector, civil society, and other stakeholders, and examines the economic ecosystem for women, offering key intervention where it's most needed. Given the nature of SIPE's mission, we've seen impressive sustainable impact from projects that develop organically, where SIPE's intervention has simply added additional resources and technical assistance. SIPE didn't make Salima or BWCCI. However, we empowered them with the tools and skills it took for them to achieve what they were able to achieve. SIPE adapted its WNBA project in Pakistan in 2017, and in the interest of time, I've decided to cut that and hope that I can come back in 6 months or so to share the stories there. But that said, I would actually like to leave you with another quote from another SIPE partner in Pakistan. Her name is Shamama Arbab, and she's the president of the Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Peshawar, Pakistan. And it's actually quite an emotional quote. If you are supported by knowledge, you are definitely respected. We knew what we were talking about because of the capacity building, because of the learning that took place, because of all the support that SIPE gave us. We knew what we were talking about. When you know what you're talking about, it's a little shocking to a society that a woman is saying the right things and knows what needs to be done. This capacity building and confidence in ourselves has changed attitudes in our society. They're shocked and they're surprised. A country's economy and democracy are like a car. If one of the wheels is not productive, how can it move? More than 52% of the society needs to be made productive in Pakistan. A woman needs to be empowered to decide for her family, her society, and her country, and the future of her society. Thank you.
That's a critical point that economically empowered women can change accountability. With that, we'll wrap up with Robin. Because Stevie can be the one to take it down. So.
Okay. Hi. Last but not least, right? How are you doing? Good? There's cookies and cupcakes. Right? So, feel free to get up. First, it's a privilege and an honor to be here. I also want to thank IFIS and Representative Jackson Lee's office and staff for making this event possible and bringing attention to sustainable development. I hate acronyms like thing. So you're going to hear me say all the words in acronyms. Sustainable development goals, which really are providing an opportunity to highlight that gender equality is the cornerstone to achieve all of them by 2030. We at Solidarity Center are particularly focused on number 5, which is the one focused on gender equality, but also number 8, which focuses on decent work. These are inextricably linked, and the work that I'm going to have the opportunity to share with you today, we are part of the world globe. So my name is Robin Runge, and I'm a senior gender specialist based here in Washington, D.C. But the Solidarity Center is a global organization, actually the largest global workers' rights organization based in the United States. We're doing work in 60 countries around the world. Our focus is we act on the fundamental principle that working people can, by exercising the right to freedom of association and forming trade unions and democratic workers' rights organizations, collectively improve their jobs and workplaces, call on their governments to uphold laws and protect human rights, and be a force for democracy, social justice, and inclusive economic development. Our mission is to empower workers to raise their voices for dignity on the job, justice in their communities, and greater equality in the global economy. So some of the themes that my fellow panelists have raised today are really highlighted in the work that I get the privilege to share with you. So I want to be very clear. I am imparting knowledge and expertise and phenomenal work that our partners and the women that I've had the privilege to meet and work with, global globally here. So we work with garment sector workers in Indonesia and Cambodia. We work with agricultural workers in Morocco. And so I'm going to be elevating their experiences and their voices here today. Specifically, what you're going to hear in these stories is increased agency and representation and leadership and policymaking that can transform their lives and their opportunities, and then increased labor force participation through recognition of unpaid and informal work. Again, themes that were raised by my panelists today. So one of our, and so I should say I'm new to Solidarity Center. I've only been there a little over a year, so I'm really bragging about the work of others. So I just want to say that. So we have had an office in Morocco for many years. And in the last 10 years, there has been a really significant emphasis in working with low-wage workers in the informal sector, in the agricultural sector, creating wine and olive oil, working with grapes. I haven't seen this yet, but I can't wait to. And women make up the majority of the workers in these jobs, and yet they have the most precarious experiences. They get paid less, right? They have limited access to any kinds of benefits. Their work is rarely recognized or paid appropriately. And yet the labor movement there really recognized this. And the Solidarity Center worked closely with the labor movement, and over a period of many years hosted a series of workshops bringing women together to discover their own leadership abilities. So this is really important. I believe that women already know how to lead. We just need to give them the space to do it. And so that's what our role is to support our union partners, right, to create that space and that opportunity for women to come together. And I know the women in the room are going to share this. When we have the opportunity to come together and talk about our experiences, whether it be with gender-based violence, right, or not getting paid appropriately, or trying to figure out how we're going to keep our job and take care of our parents or our children, we can create a sense of agency that if you have a background and an experience within a union about collective power, right, and about the power of coming together with voices, you can bring that to that space to affect change. So what ended up happening is after a series of years where women who went through these programs then took on leadership positions and decision-making positions within those unions in the agricultural sector in Morocco, they then were a part of the bargaining process for a new collective bargaining agreement. And as you might imagine, that collective bargaining agreement looked a little different. Because it incorporated the needs and interests of the women in that workforce who were disproportionately in low-paying jobs, disproportionately not getting training opportunities, disproportionately in unsafe working conditions. And so the collective bargaining agreement that they were able to negotiate with the employer is really remarkable. I actually have 12 copies in Arabic that I can't read and one in English. And what it highlights is exactly what I'm talking about, an emphasis on things that all workers benefit from, right? But specifically from a woman's perspective. And we actually just completed a study, because it's been 5 years since the collective bargaining agreement was negotiated, to see how have the women's lives changed as a result of this collective bargaining agreement. And overwhelmingly through this research, what we found is they are getting higher paid jobs, they are getting access to training opportunities, and thereby getting different job opportunities. They feel their jobs are more secure, right? So they're not in a situation where they feel if they become pregnant, right, or they miss a day of work to take care of their children, that they're going to get fired, because those protections are all incorporated into the agreement. It's actually quite a remarkable example of the things that we're talking about, right? Increased agency and access to decision-making has led to improvements in their economic power in that workplace and in that industry. And note what I described too is access to decision-making within the union structure and thus affecting their entire workplace. My second example is more recent and is related to work that we're doing in Indonesia and Cambodia with garment sector workers on gender-based violence. And so since Me Too, we've obviously in the last year or so seen an increased attention paid and understanding to the experiences of women and men in the workplace with gender-based violence, specifically sexual harassment and sexual assault. And that has really highlighted the gaps between what laws protect and what women are actually experiencing, among other things. And so what we were doing in Indonesia and Cambodia is, again, creating safe spaces where women are coming together for the first time, just like what we saw, I think, with Me Too Online. For the first time, many of these women are disclosing that they themselves have experienced sexual assault, sexual violence, and other forms of gender-based violence in the workplace. And again, by creating a space where they come together, and they are all women in the unions that we've been a part of supporting over many years, these women are now in leadership positions in some instances in these unions, but they've never talked about this issue. So it's never been integrated into negotiations with the employers or protections or any of those things. And what has happened is they themselves have discovered that every single woman in these groups we brought together has experienced some form of gender-based violence, but that it was hidden, right? That they weren't speaking about it. So certainly, it's not going to be something that's going to be a priority in the union unless they can demonstrate that there is a need. And so these women on their own identified a desire to conduct interviews with their coworkers to collect information, not in a complaint-driven structure, right? So just like in the United States, women there are afraid to come forward and speak of what they're experiencing because they're afraid they're going to be retaliated against, either physically or economically or socially. And so they recognize that a measurement of is this really a problem based on how many complaints have been filed is not one that's working. Anybody in the room feel that makes sense, right? So instead, what they said is what we want to do is we want to be trained on how to conduct interviews with our sisters in the workplace, because we believe we can talk to our sisters and in that way learn about what they're experiencing and bring that forward to the leadership in our union. In Indonesia, they're now working with the manpower. The manpower department, I think they need to change that, but whatever. Labor, the equivalent of the Department of Labor, right, to advocate for changes in enforcement of the limited protections that do currently exist. And now they've elevated this. There's law being drafted called the Violence Against Women Act in Indonesia that previously did not mention the workplace at all. And now they're a part of the dialogues, and they've brought forward the stories that they've collected from their sisters into that dialogue as well. So again, creating spaces where women can come together, right, and use the power they already have to affect change as they define it. I think that's the other thing I just want to say is their definition of gender-based violence doesn't look like Title VII, just in case anyone is wondering. Okay, it's very tailored to their experiences. So again, I hope those are some examples that elucidate what my fellow panelists have been talking about. And again, honor and privilege to be here and truly to share the phenomenal work that I've been privileged to be a part of and to learn about at the Solidarity Center. So thank you.